On the night of April 14th, 1912, the most valuable collection of human beings ever gathered on a single ship was sailing across the North Atlantic. The Titanic wasn't just carrying passengers. It was carrying some of the richest men who had ever lived. They had the best rooms, the best food, the best of everything money could buy. And in a few hours, most of them would be dead, and their money would not save a single one of them. This is John Jacob Astor IV. When he stepped aboard the Titanic, he was worth around $87 million, the equivalent of nearly $3 billion today, making him one of the richest men in the entire world. Beside him was his new wife, Madeline. She was 18 years old and 5 months pregnant. They were coming home so their baby could be born in America. When the Titanic struck the iceberg, Astor helped Madeline into a lifeboat. Then he asked if he could join her because of her condition. The officer said no. Women and children first. Astor didn't argue. He stepped back onto the deck, lit a cigarette, and told her he would see her later. Madeline survived. Astor did not. His body was recovered days later. She gave birth to their son that August. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what the Titanic was. She was the largest moving object ever built by human hands, and her first-class decks were a floating palace, a grand staircase crowned with a glass dome, a dining saloon the size of a cathedral, a swimming pool, a Turkish bath, private promenades. A single first-class suite cost more than most men earned in a lifetime. And the men who booked those suites were not merely wealthy. They were titans of industry, heirs to empires, some of the most powerful people on earth, gathered in one place, crossing the ocean in what everyone believed was the safest ship ever made. In command was Captain Edward Smith, the most senior and most trusted captain in the White Star Line, making what was meant to be the final, glorious voyage before his retirement. The Titanic was called practically unsinkable. Her passengers boarded with the total confidence of people who had never, in their lives, been told no. They had the best of everything, and they believed, as the rich so often do, that catastrophe was something that happened to other people. 4 days into the crossing, on a cold, still, moonless night, that belief met an iceberg, and over the next 2 hours and 40 minutes, every advantage their money had ever bought them slowly, quietly, stopped mattering. Benjamin Guggenheim was heir to one of America's great mining fortunes. He was traveling in first class with his valet, his chauffeur, and quietly, his French mistress in a separate cabin. When the ship began to sink, Guggenheim and his valet first put on life jackets. But then, he did something extraordinary. He went back to his cabin and changed into white tie and tails, full evening dress. He returned to the deck, dressed as if for dinner, and said the line that made him immortal. "We are dressed in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." He asked a surviving steward to carry a message to his wife. Tell her he did his duty, that no woman was left aboard because Benjamin Guggenheim was a coward. Then he sat down with a glass of brandy and a cigar and waited. He was never seen again. His body was never found. Isidor Straus was the co-owner of Macy's, then, as now, one of the most famous stores in the world. He was traveling with Ida, his wife of over 40 years. When the lifeboats were loaded, the officers offered the elderly couple a place. Because of his age, no one would have objected to Isidor boarding with his wife. He refused. He would not go before the other men. So the officers turned to Ida. She, at least, should be saved. And Ida Straus made a choice that people still talk about a century later. She stepped out of the lifeboat, walked back to her husband, and said, "We have lived together for many years. Where you go, I go." They were last seen sitting together on the deck, arm in arm, as the ship went down. Isidor's body was later recovered. Ida's never was. Astor, Guggenheim, and the Strausses were not alone. The Titanic's first class read like a directory of the Gilded Age. There was George Widener, heir to a Philadelphia streetcar fortune, traveling with his wife and son. George would die, his son Harry would die, and only his wife would survive. There was John Thayer, a railroad executive, whose teenage son Jack survived by leaping into the freezing water, and later wrote one of the most haunting accounts of the sinking ever recorded. There was Major Archibald Butt, the trusted military aide to the President of the United States, last seen helping women into the boats with perfect composure. And there were men whose names history barely kept, who gave up their seats without a word. But perhaps the most remembered of all were not passengers at all. They were the ship's musicians, an 8-man band led by a young violinist named Wallace Hartley. As the ship went down and panic spread across the decks, the band did something almost impossible to believe. They kept playing. Witnesses said the music never stopped, calm and steady, until the very end. Not one of the 8 musicians survived. They had no fortune to lose. They chose instead to give the dying something to hold on to. Here is the part the money could not touch. The Titanic carried lifeboats for barely half the people aboard. It was not an oversight of poverty. It was a decision made by wealthy, confident men who believed the boats would never truly be needed, who thought a deck cluttered with lifeboats looked unsightly. So when the water came in, there was never going to be room for everyone. The lifeboats were loaded women and children first, and in that rule, the fortunes reversed. In first class, most of the women lived, but most of the first-class men, the richest men on the ship, died, because the code of their era asked them to step back, and most of them did. Their money bought them one last thing, and one thing only: the choice of how to face the end. Some met it in evening dress. Some met it arm in arm with the person they loved. Some met it helping strangers into the boats. And the iceberg that ended them all was, in the end, just ice, drifting silently in the dark, older than any of their fortunes, and completely indifferent to every name on that passenger list. Not every rich passenger died, and the most famous survivor of them all was Margaret Brown, who history would rename the unsinkable Molly Brown. Brown was new money. She had struck it rich in mining out west, and the old money set never quite accepted her. She had spent that winter traveling with the Astors and boarded the Titanic to hurry home to a sick grandchild. She was put into Lifeboat 6, and once it was on the water, she did what the men in charge would not. She demanded they row back to pull survivors out of the freezing sea. When the quartermaster refused, she threatened to throw him overboard and had the other women take up the oars. She survived and spent the rest of her life helping the other survivors. The woman society looked down on became its hero. When the numbers came in, they told a brutal story about wealth and who lived. In first class, most of the women survived, but most of the first-class men died. They had every advantage in life, and in the end, their money bought them nothing but a dignified way to die. Astor, Guggenheim, Strauss, some of the richest men on the planet, and the North Atlantic did not know their names and did not care. We remember the Titanic as a ship, but it was also a room full of the most fortunate people alive, and a few hours that stripped every one of them down to the same thing: a person, in the cold, deciding how to face the end. Some clutched their fortunes. Some gave up their seats. One old woman refused to leave the man she loved. Their money is gone. Their names are half forgotten. But these photographs remain. The last images of the richest passengers on the Titanic, taken before the sea, made them all equal. If you want more true stories hidden inside old photographs, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.